Have you ever stopped to think that sometimes the greatest source of terror is not in what we see, but in what we can't explain? What would make you feel truly uncomfortable? Imagine being in the safest place in the world, surrounded by friends and light, and yet feeling that something is wrong, something invisible but palpable haunting him. It was a cold November night in 1999 in Portland, Oregon. The winds cut through the streets of the city, and the first snows began to cover the ground. High up in an ancient oak tree, hidden among the treetops, was Will's treehouse, a place where he, his best friend Lucas, and shy Sarah had gathered for years to escape the world below. It was their own sanctuary, away from the eyes of adults, where they felt in control of everything, or at least they thought so. Will's treehouse wasn't big, but it was cozy. With the time-worn planks and the view of a thick forest all around, the place had the kind of rustic charm that only childhood can provide. But that night, something seemed to be out of place. The wind whispered stronger than usual, and as the night wore on, the shadows seemed to take shape. "Let's do something different tonight," Will said, with that mischievous smile, challenging his friends to join him in another of his insane ideas. "Let's see that movie that everyone is talking about, the one that no one has the courage to watch." Until the end, Lucas, always the most daring, agreed without hesitation, but Sarah didn't seem so enthusiastic. She always felt that there was something wrong with those nights, a sense that the fun could turn into something much scarier. But she, as always, decided not to let her fears take over. What they didn't know, and what they would soon discover, was that this night would be different from all the others. Something or someone was watching from the darkness, and the fun could quickly turn into an impossible nightmare to escape. Night fell quickly, and the city lights of Portland seemed distant, almost unreal. Will's treehouse, now just a small silhouette against the dark sky, was lit by a faint lamp hanging from the ceiling, offering a small refuge from the darkness that spread through the forest. The wind was still blowing strong, but the three friends were immune to it, immersed in the excitement of another night together. However, something in the atmosphere was strangely charged, as if the surrounding forest itself was silent, waiting for something. Will, always the leader of the group, plugged the old VHS tape into the player he had taken to the treehouse. "This is the movie that everyone talks about," he said, his smile still on his face, trying to hide the growing tension he was also beginning to feel. "They say that no one can ever finish." The film, an old home recording of an isolated town in upstate Oregon, was something Will found at a flea market. The images were grainy, and the sound quality was terrible, but there was something about the plot that, even in its raw form, drew attention. The story dealt with ancient rituals and entities, legends that surrounded the region. Something that didn't seem to fit with the reality that Will knew. He thought it would be perfect for scaring his friends. Sarah, however, did not share the same excitement. She always felt that there was something wrong with movies like that, with stories involving things that shouldn't be explored. "I don't know, Will. That sounds too strange," she said, a slight tremor in her voice. "Do you really think it's a good idea?" But Lucas, the bravest of the group, did not hesitate. "Come on, Sarah, we're here for that, aren't we? Just a movie, what can happen?" He sat next to Will, already picking up the popcorn that was in a makeshift bowl. The movie began, and the first few minutes seemed innocent. A story about a remote community with its traditions and beliefs. But as the plot progressed, the atmosphere in the treehouse began to change. The feeling of discomfort intensified. The old recording showed images of rituals and shadowy figures, almost unrecognizable, with muffled sounds of distant screams and chants that seemed to vibrate in the very wood of the treehouse. Sarah began to move uncomfortably in her seat, looking at the other two with wide eyes, as if she was beginning to understand that perhaps there was something more there. When the first scream echoed from the film, as if it were a warning, Sarah stood up abruptly. "I'm not going to watch this anymore." "It's not right," she said, her voice trembling. Will and Lucas didn't listen to her, or rather, they didn't want to. They were fascinated, almost mesmerized by the image of the figure that appeared on the screen. A tall, completely black-eyed silhouette that slowly approached the camera. A skinwalker. The story of the skinwalker was a popular legend among Native Americans, especially in remote regions like those in the Oregon countryside, where reality and the supernatural often blur. It is said that these beings could change shape, taking on human or animal appearances to hunt their victims. Although the friends were just watching a movie, an indescribable feeling began to form in the air. Something was wrong. "Turn it off now, Will," Sarah shouted, her voice filled with panic. "Something's going on out there." Will and Lucas were so immersed in the film that they didn't realize it initially. But when the image on the screen suddenly started to distort, as if the video was failing, they felt it. The wind seemed to have stopped. The sound was clearer now, closer. The sound of grass moving, something approaching the treehouse. Then a faint knock, almost inaudible but unmistakable, came from the window. It was a sound that didn't belong in the ordinary Portland night. What could it be? They looked at each other, and adrenaline began to spread through their bodies. Something was out there, watching them. "It was just the wind, right?" said Lucas, trying to stay calm. But he knew, as did the others, that it wasn't. The silence was broken by a different, deeper sound coming from the forest. Something was moving. Will was the first to stand up, his trembling hand reaching for the VHS tape to turn it off. But before he could touch it, the light in the treehouse flickered and went out. Darkness took over the place, and with it, a deep fear set in. The film was still running, but the screen now showed only a still image. And behind her, something seemed to move in the shadow. "Did you hear that?" Will asked, his voice low, hesitant. Before anyone could answer, another, stronger sound echoed. It was more than just a snap. It felt like a heavy step. Someone, or something, was approaching the ladder that led up to the treehouse. And then, as if everything was in slow motion, they heard a low, drawling whisper coming from outside. "I saw you." The tension was about to explode, and the three friends, now paralyzed, tried to find an explanation. But nothing seemed to make sense. What was that sound? What was really going on that night? What else was lurking, waiting to reveal his gloomy face? And with that question still up in the air, they had no idea how close they were to the real threat. The silence in the treehouse was heavy, and the darkness seemed to close around them, engulfing even the sound of their hearts. The light from the lamp had faded, leaving only the shadows stretching out like hungry claws. Will, Lucas, and Sarah were paralyzed, not knowing what to do or how to react. The only thing they could hear was the sound of their own hearts pounding. The fear, visceral and deep, settles with the perception of imminent danger, leaving behind the distant feeling of horror movies. Now it is something palpable, real, something lurking in the shadows of the forest. Fear overwhelms them, affecting bodies and minds, creating a growing sense of suffocation. The idea that they are being watched, that they are not alone, grows unbearably. This is psychological fear, where the imagination begins to work against them, creating monsters more terrifying than any real being. Lucas was the first to move, but his attempt to control the situation only increased the panic. He hastily stood up, trying to look for any logical explanation, something that could ward off that growing fear. But as he looked out the window of the treehouse, he saw only darkness. That kind of impenetrable darkness that swallows the light and makes even the bravest question whether they are really seeing what they think they see. "It's not right. Something is watching us," he said, his voice lower, almost like a whisper. "Sarah, was beginning to feel the effects of fear on her body. His knees trembled and his breathing quickened, as if his body knew something his mind could not yet fully comprehend. The fear was not only mental, he was starting to become physical. She stepped away from the window and went to the corner of the treehouse, trying to control her breathing, trying to stay rational. But nothing seemed to make sense. The feeling that they were being followed, hunted, intensified by the second. Will, on the other hand, tried to stay calm, his mind working a mile a minute. He looked at his friends, trying to find some answer in their faces. But what he saw was the reflection of his own feelings. Fear, insecurity, a sense that they were out of control. "We need to get out of here," he said, but his voice didn't sound as convincing as he would have liked. He knew that getting out of the treehouse might be the only way to survive, but the idea of facing whatever was out there seemed even more terrifying. And then, as if to validate all his worst fears, a noise came from outside, a strange, drawling sound coming from the base of the tree. Something heavy was moving toward the house, as if it were climbing. The fear that the three friends felt was no longer an abstraction, but a palpable, tangible reality, almost like a presence, a force that approached. Survival is, at its core, an instinctive reaction to fear. When we are faced with a real and imminent threat, our self-preservation instincts kick in, and that's what happened to the three friends. Their brains began to operate in emergency mode. All they wanted now was to escape, but doubt and panic paralyzed them. The treehouse had been their refuge, but now it looked like the prison where they were trapped. With each step the figure took toward the stairs, the air became denser, harder to breathe. The sound of the stairs creaking under the weight of the creature that climbed was enough to break any shred of logic that still existed in the minds of Will, Lucas, and Sarah. It was as if they were being pulled by an invisible thread that connected them to that unknown being, an uncontrollable, powerful, and insidious force. "Go away," shouted Sarah, her voice trembling but full of despair. But the answer she got was not a word, not a sound. It was the feeling that his voice had no power over it. The creature was coming, and with it the certainty that they were being hunted. Will, in a desperate impulse, tried to call the police, but his cell phone, previously fully charged, was now blacked out, as if it were being blocked by an invisible force. The emptiness in the digital space seemed to reflect the emptiness that was forming in his mind. Nothing was more within his reach. There was no help, only darkness and threat. And then the light of the treehouse flickered one last time and went out, leaving them in complete darkness. They could only hear the sound of each of their heavy breathing, the beating of their hearts, the creaking of the stairs, and finally the sound they feared most, the sound of something moving in the door of the treehouse. But before they could react, something different happened. The sound of the creature stopped abruptly. There were no more steps. There was no more breathing, only silence, now heavier than ever. What was going on? Was it just a trick of the mind? Or had the creature cornered them in a way they couldn't understand? The struggle for survival was intensifying. Every move now could be decisive. And as silence spread around the treehouse, the tension was palpable, almost impossible to bear. What would they do now? The answer was closer than they could have imagined. The silence stretched the time until the hours seemed to drag on. But they were no more than seconds. The darkness, pitch black, enveloped. The treehouse and the three could barely see each other. His eyes tried to get used to the lack of light, but everything around him seemed more alive, more threatening. The weight of the tension became almost unbearable. They were helpless, at the mercy of a presence they could not comprehend, something beyond their worst nightmares, something that seemed to study them. Will, Lucas, and Sarah were immobilized, trapped in their own fears, unable to make any move. Every sound seemed amplified. The rustling of leaves in the wind, the creaking of treehouse planks, and above all, the subtle but soaring sound of something approaching. Something that was adapting to its environment, like a creature that remakes itself with each step, as if it were a living part of the night itself. It was then that the sound became clearer, more defined. Something was on the stairs, higher, heavier than before, a sound that wasn't human, but it wasn't completely animal either. It was a grotesque mixture of the two, a monstrous fusion between human and wolf, something that defied any attempt at rational explanation. The creature, once hidden in the shadows, began to slowly emerge, its monstrous form distorting and extending as if it was adapting to its own environment. With every movement, the darkness seemed to give way before her power, as if she was consuming everything around her. Its legs, long and disproportionate, resembled those of a wolf, with thick black fur, but its feet, huge and clumsy, dragged with a disconcerting lightness, as if they were floating on the ground. The sound his feet made when they touched the wood of the treehouse reverberated in the air, as if the very structure of the refuge was being compressed by his invisible weight. The upper part of his body, although still human, was distorted. His skin looked thick and irregular, as if it had been twisted and shaped by forces that did not belong to nature. The creature's chest was tilted forward, as if constant pressure had deformed it, its shoulders broad and muscular but grotesque, as if its joints were dislocated. The long, curved arms ended in hands, whose sharp claws reflected the faint light of the treehouse, ready to tear apart any resistance. But what terrified her most were her eyes. There were no pupils, just a black void that seemed to swallow the surrounding light. And when she fixed them, the creature's gaze crossed the three friends as if it was seeing directly into their souls. In that moment, the feeling of being watched was no longer something abstract. It was a palpable presence, a force that seemed to invade his thoughts, probing his deepest weaknesses. The creature's eyes shone like an insensitive abyss, and with that, the reality around them seemed to begin to distort. With each step, the creature seemed to manipulate space itself, as if the surrounding reality bowed before its power. The claws scraped the wood with a high-pitched sound, as if they wanted to tear apart not only the house, but the very perception of time. The air became thicker and more stifling, and each breath seemed harder to swallow. It was as if the air was being compressed, being absorbed by her presence. It was as if the creature was not just physical, but a manifestation of a deeper evil, a force of pure destruction which shaped the reality around it. She wasn't just a beast looking for meat. He was an intelligent, cunning, and manipulative entity who studied his victims, their reactions, their weaknesses. The creature took a step towards the door of the treehouse. Its claws clasped at the wood with a high-pitched, cruel sound. The noise reverberated like a promise that nothing could stop her. But what was most disturbing was the fact that she was evolving, adapting to her environment. Every movement, every gesture seemed more fluid, more natural. She was no longer an uncontrolled beast, but rather a thinking entity, a force with intelligence, one that was studying her targets, watching their reactions. Lucas was the first to react, trying to move, trying to do something to protect his friends. But before he could leave the place, the creature made a sound that couldn't be called a scream. It was a kind of muffled howl, which reverberated through the treehouse, making the walls shake. The sound was not only coming from his throat, but seemed to emanate from his entire being, as if the very air was being forced to vibrate with his presence. It was a warning. "Stay where you are," whispered Sarah, holding Lucas, her voice full of terror. "Don't move. He's studying us." Will, who was calmer, watched with wide eyes as the creature began to approach the stairs. The distance between them was rapidly narrowing. He felt fear take over his body, but he also knew that if they didn't do something soon, the creature would catch them one by one, without mercy. What the three friends did not fully understand was that this adaptation was a reflection of the creature's own nature. She was no longer a forgotten legend. She was no longer just a monster of indigenous mythology. The creature was evolving based on your reactions. She had already been smart enough to discover that her greatest asset was not in brute force, but in patience, in cunning, in the ability to understand fear. The combination of animal instinct and human skill made this creature even more dangerous. She knew how to strike unpredictably, how to manipulate her victims to the point of mental breaking. And now, more than ever, the three friends were beginning to understand that they weren't just dealing with a physical being. They were facing a psychological predator who knew how to use them against themselves. Time was running out. The creature was about to make its final move, and the only thing left for the friends was one last attempt to escape. But before they could take any steps, the door of the treehouse opened with a bang, as if it were the last barrier between them and the abyss. It was the only chance they had. Either they would run now, or they would never be able to run again. The air was heavy, almost unbreathable. The treehouse, once a sanctuary of safety and fun, was now transformed into a cramped and oppressive space where the feeling of confinement grew. Every breath was difficult, every movement more calculated. The creature, with its human-wolf hybrid body, continued to approach, its claws scraping against the wood as it crawled toward the door. The environment, once so familiar and comfortable, now seemed to be changing. Something was changing around them, something they could not comprehend. Will, Lucas and Sarah were paralyzed, not only by fear, but by the feeling that they were in a different domain. Whatever was out there was no longer something that could be explained with logic or science. That being was not a simple creature, but something that transcended the limits of reality. It was the supernatural, something that existed beyond human reach, something that was beyond what his senses could comprehend. "What is this?" Lucas asked, his voice a whisper full of dread. It's not possible." Sarah, wide-eyed, could barely breathe. She didn't know if she was seeing an illusion, if her mind was playing tricks on her, but there was something undeniable about that presence. The creature did not behave like an animal. She wasn't just there to hunt or destroy. There was an intelligence. Behind his movements, a strategy. I was testing them, waiting for them to make a mistake, studying their reaction as fear took over their minds. And in that moment, Will had the feeling that this creature wasn't something otherworldly just in a physical sense. She seemed to be connected to something much older and more powerful, as if she were connected to the very fabric of reality. The surrounding sounds distorted, the air became thick, and time seemed to slow down. It was as if the night itself had life, as if the supernatural world itself was manifesting itself there around them. On an impulse, Will ran to the window, trying to find a way out, a way to escape. But what he saw made him stop instantly. There was no longer just the darkness of the forest or the emptiness of the night. There were shapes moving between the trees, shadows that stretched and merged, with outlines that seemed to flow like water. They weren't just watching, they were waiting, as if they were part of a larger network, connected to this creature. He didn't know if they were there to help, or if they were just watching the game. "This isn't real," Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the creature, trying to convince herself that it was all a nightmare. It can't be, but the creature, now closer than ever, proved that it was all very real. Her eyes, black and deep, looked directly at Will's, as if reading his thoughts. There was a sense of dominance, as if the creature was not only physically hunting, but invading their minds, controlling their perceptions, distorting what they saw, what they heard, what they felt. The creature with its twisted and deformed body grew sharper and clearer as the darkness around it seemed to give way. The shadows that once enveloped her began to dissociate from her form, as if they were being consumed by her. She wasn't just a beast, she was the embodiment of something much deeper, a force that was beyond any mundane explanation. Then a burst of white light illuminated the room, blinding them momentarily. Will, Lucas, and Sarah fell to their knees, covering their eyes, but even through the light they could see. What once looked like a beast and animal creature now looked more like an ancient entity, a spiritual force with an almost tangible presence. She was there for more than just hunting. He was there to mark their destinies, as if he wanted to leave them with a mark, a scar on their body and soul, and as if it were part of the very act of hunting, the creature has risen, not only in height but in power. It no longer moved like a beast, but as something that was preparing to materialize completely, controlling the space around it. His eyes shone a deep red, and the feeling that they were being pierced by his presence increased even more. "And time is coming," Will said, not sure if he was talking to his friends or to himself. His mind was paralyzed, but a part of him knew they could no longer wait for a miracle. The time to fight or run had come. The supernatural was unfolding before them, and there was no turning back. With the terror and understanding of the creature's true nature now upon them, the friends were faced with a desperate choice: escape or face the unknown. Tension paralyzed them, and time was against them. The creature was now within their reach. Will, Lucas, and Sarah were paralyzed, their hearts beating 1,000, trying to process what was happening. The claws of the beast, shining in the dim light of the treehouse, indicated impending danger. There was no more room for doubt. The creature moved with frightening precision, as if it already knew exactly what to do, as if it had studied each of them, their fears and weaknesses. It wasn't just a physical threat. It was an intelligent presence, a supernatural force that seemed to command the scene, forcing them to act. "Now!" shouted Will, his voice cutting through the tension. He knew that if they didn't react immediately, all would be lost. But what to do? Fleeing didn't seem like a viable option, and facing it head-on seemed equally insane. They were alone against something they couldn't even understand, something that didn't belong to the reality they knew. Sarah was paralyzed, her eyes fixed on the creature, unable to process the fear that gripped her body. Every bit of his mind told him to run, to get away from that monstrous being, but his body didn't respond. She felt as if she was being watched not only through the creature's eyes, but also through something deeper, something that controlled even her own thoughts. Lucas, on the other hand, seemed to be starting to move. His fear was transformed into something more, a pulsating rage, a desire not to be a victim. He looked at Will with determined eyes. "We're not going to let that happen," he said, his voice firm. "We have to fight. If we don't do something now, it will be too late." Will felt a flame of hope rise in his chest. Luke's anger seemed the only thing that could break through the dread that paralyzed them. They weren't just prey, not yet. The creature could be immensely strong, but they had something it didn't possess: the ability to act against fear, to unite in adversity. But before they could take any steps toward action, the creature made its move. A muffled sound, like that, of bones breaking and muscles stretching, emitted from his throat. It was a low sound, almost like a warning, but loaded with an imminent threat. The creature was preparing to attack, and the only instinct left to the friends was to run, fight, or wait to be destroyed. "We have to get out now," shouted Sarah, finally finding her voice, despair mixed with an attempt at logic. But the creature, with a piercing gaze, did not seem to allow them even a second to think. And then, as if time had run out, the three friends felt that their only choice now would be to face the conflict with all that was left of their strength, or to be consumed by what watched them. With the creature almost within reach, the fight for survival was about to begin. The only question was whether they would be able to confront the evil that had taken shape before them. The next move could be the last. Time seemed to slow down as the creature inched closer, its heavy footsteps echoing through the treehouse. Will, Lucas, and Sarah were immersed in a sea of frantic thoughts, anxiety taking over each of them in different ways. The fear came not only from knowing that they were facing a monstrous being, but from the uncertainty of what would happen next. From the feeling that everything around them was out of control. Sarah tried to gather the strength to move, but panic seemed to have taken hold of her body. With each breath, the air seemed denser, harder to absorb. She felt as if she was sinking into an abyss, fear extending and spreading through every cell of her body. Anxiety was what dominated his mind, the idea of not being able to do anything, to change his destiny, of having no control over what was about to happen. Every movement the creature made was a reminder of how far out of its depth they were. I can't, murmured Sarah, her voice choked with tension. She wanted to run, scream, but her body seemed unresponsive. Fear had taken a physical form in her, like a pressure that crushed her, making every thought more difficult to organize. Fight or flight was not a simple choice. It was a torturous psychological dilemma. Will, on the other hand, was feeling the effects of anxiety in a more subtle but equally devastating way. He tried to stay calm, but with each look at the creature, a nightmare arose in his mind. He knew that the chances of survival were slim, almost nil, but still, he needed to try. Something inside insisted on continuing, a flame of hope that did not want to go out. But even that flame began to waver, doubt eating away at him. "If we do something, we have to do it now," Will said, trying to sound firm, though his voice trembled. With the same anxiety that gripped him, the weight of uncertainty consumed him. What exactly could they do to face something so far from their comprehension? He knew that facing it physically felt like suicide, but running away no longer seemed like a viable option. There were no more escape routes. Lucas, the most impulsive, was battling what could be described as a wave of paralyzing anxiety. His instinct for action was in direct conflict with the paralyzing fear that held him in place. He looked at his friends, at Sarah, whose eyes were filled with panic, and felt a lump form in his throat. What should I do? Everything seemed so far away, so out of reach, and at the same time so terribly close. If we don't do anything, it will be worse, Lucas said, finally finding his voice, though the words came out laden with uncertainty. He knew he had to act, but the options were limited, and the fear of making the fatal mistake was overwhelming. Anxiety made him question every second if he was making the right decision. The creature, realizing the conflict between them, took a decisive step. His gaze, penetrating and evil, seemed to test their courage, as if feeding on the fear that was present in each one. It was as if the beast knew that that moment of hesitation could be the key to its success. Fear was his ally, and the creature had learned to feed on doubt. Fear overwhelmed the three, paralyzing them. Flee or fight? The dilemma became clearer and clearer, and the pressure increased with each breath. But there was another sensation, a growing realization that any wrong move, any more hesitation, could be fatal. With the creature's gaze still fixed on them, a sense of urgency took over. They could no longer wait. They could no longer allow fear to overwhelm them. Every second was precious, and they needed to decide now, or they would be consumed by darkness, not just physical, but psychological. Time was running out, and the decision they made could mean the difference between life and death. Fear had become the most insidious enemy of all, and now, in their fight for survival, they had to face the impossible. But what could save their lives in the face of the unknown? The answer was about to be revealed, but it was a path fraught with risks. The creature was closer now, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. Every step he took made the wood of the treehouse creak, as if the very environment was bowing before his presence. Will's heart pounded, his mind clouded by adrenaline and fear. There was no more time to hesitate. There was no more room for doubt. They needed to act, or they would be consumed by that supernatural being. "Now!" shouted Will, his voice hoarse, breaking the silence that enveloped them. He didn't know what to do, but he needed to take the first step. They were on the fine line between life and death, and fear, once again, was a psychological prison. The impulse for action surpassed anything else. The creature already knew that they were paralyzed by panic, and this only made the confrontation more dangerous. Lucas, seized by the same sense of urgency, threw himself forward. He took one of the planks from the treehouse, trying to use it as a kind of makeshift stick. It wasn't the perfect weapon, but at that moment it was all I had. "Let's fight! We can't let her get us," he said, anger now taking over his voice. But as he approached, he stopped abruptly. The creature, noticing the approach, rose even more imposingly. His limbs lengthened, his eyes fixed on Lucas with a disturbing intensity. She did not move like an animal. It was more like a force of nature controlling the space around it. The howl he emitted was a mixture of animal and something profoundly human, a scream that reverberated through his bones. It was as if the creature was trying to break its psychological resistance. The fear now came not only from the sight of her, but from the feeling that no matter how hard they fought, she had control of the situation. Sarah, however, reacted differently. She looked at her friends, and for the first time that night, something flashed in her eyes. Not fear, but determination. "We cannot be defeated by fear," she said, more to herself than to others. She knew that if they let the creature completely overwhelm them, there would be no turning back. The game was about to change, and she was ready to fight. With blade in hand, she faced the creature with astonishing courage. Will, now also seized by the need to do something, grabbed a rope that was nearby and threw himself after Sarah. He knew he couldn't let her face this thing alone. "Together we will make it," he shouted, his voice sounding firmer than it really felt, but the fear was still present, like a shadow that never left them. The creature then took a step towards Sarah, and it was at that moment that an inexplicable energy manifested. The blade she held shone for an instant, reflecting the light that now originated not from the treehouse, but from a distant source, a mysterious, otherworldly glow. The creature faltered, as if it was being contained by an outside force, something beyond its power. The light seemed to envelop the blade, and a deep sound, like a distant roar, echoed around, causing the trees around the treehouse to sway violently. The inexplicable energy that surged seemed like their only chance at survival, an outside force, guiding them. The creature, as strong as it was now facing something greater, something that somehow was holding her back. But how long would this protection last? And what else could happen next? The fight was far from over, and the fate of the three friends was still uncertain. The creature retreated, but the glow did not dissipate. It was clear that the confrontation was far from resolved. As the tension mounted, the question that lingered was, what else could this energy reveal about the true nature of that beast? They were closer to the truth, but what would come next could be even more terrifying. The creature hesitated, retreating for the first time since it had rushed forward with fury. His form was still more shadow than flesh, but something in his movement had changed. There was now an ominous fluidity to her posture, as if an invisible force was preventing her from moving with the same brutality. Sarah's blade, with the almost supernatural light it radiated, did not cease. The glow did not fade, as if defying the creature's very nature, as it tried in vain to understand this newfound power. This is working," said Sarah, her voice full of incredulity but also hope. She could hardly believe that somewhere in the back of her mind she had found this strength, something that came from within, but also from something beyond. The fear that had paralyzed her before seemed to be now dissipating. She was no longer alone. There was something bigger, stronger, working with her. Will, seeing the light in Sarah, felt renewed. He knew that without her help they wouldn't have made it this far. It was a feeling he couldn't describe, but the loyalty and friendship they shared became a shield against terror. They weren't just three friends trying to survive a nightmare. Now they were united by something much deeper, the strength of unity, trust, and shared courage. "Sarah, we're going to get out of this, together, no matter what," Will said, looking her straight in the eye. He could feel the energy around them, an energy fueled by their friendship, the belief that no matter how great the threat, they would have enough strength to face whatever came their way. Lucas, who had been a step behind until then, felt the gravity of the situation transform. The fear was still there, but the anger he felt for the creature was replaced by a clear perception of what was happening. They were fighting, not just for their own survival, but for everyone's survival. They were more than individuals now. They were a collective force, and their friendship was what kept them going. "This is not just about us. It's about keeping what we have, about what we are. We're going to get through this," Lucas said, with a new determination in his voice. He knew that if any of his friends fell, the fight would be in vain. They were a team, and there was no room for weakness. Loyalty was not just an abstract concept now, but an absolute necessity. The creature, apparently sensing the change in the atmosphere, made a sudden forward movement, trying to break through the invisible barrier formed by Sarah's blade. The attack, though fierce, was thwarted by that force which still surrounded them. They couldn't give up. They could not allow fear to come back to grip them. Whatever was happening there, that light, that energy, was a last chance, a unique opportunity. But this opportunity depended on their unity. With a collective scream, Sarah, Will, and Lucas forged forward, no longer as victims, but as warriors who understood that their lives and their friendship were now irrevocably intertwined. They were not just fighting for themselves, but for what they represented to each other. They were stronger together, more powerful together. As they advanced, the creature took a final, powerful step. The floor of the treehouse shook, and a deafening roar echoed, as if calling for something greater to intervene. The light on the blade began to flicker, and the tension grew again. The battle was far from over. With each movement, each breath, the certainty that something much greater awaited them grew. But the real question now was, how much more could they sustain this? Force? Friendship and loyalty had brought them there, but what else would the future hold? The worst could still be to come. The treehouse was in a tense silence. The creature, which had previously seemed like a brute and physical force, now showed itself to be more subtle, more manipulative. She had learned something crucial about the three friends. It was no longer enough to physically attack. It was entering their minds, shaping their thoughts and fears, distorting their realities. Their fear now manifested itself in ways they could not control. Sarah, standing with the blade now ineffective, began to feel something strange. The feeling of being watched not only by the creature, but by something deeper. It was as if his own deepest fears were taking shape around him. Images of his past, of moments of failure and fear, began to invade his mind. Memories of when he was a child, when he could not save someone dear to him, now appeared as if they were real visions. She felt that the creature was using these memories against her. "No. Not now," Sarah whispered, trying to push the images away. But it was as if the visions were being projected by their own innermost fears. She could no longer distinguish reality from hallucinations. The creature, with its supernatural ability, was manipulating Sarah's perception, making her question her own sanity. Will, standing next to Sarah, felt the pressure of his own thoughts and fears taking shape. The creature did not attack him directly. Instead, it seeped into his mind, feeding on his doubts. Images of past failures, of bad decisions, of moments when he hadn't been strong enough, began to haunt him. He saw the faces of people he had failed to protect, and in each of them there was an expression of disapproval. The memories were clear, vivid. These weren't just flashes of his life. They were photons of his own fear, becoming more real by the moment. "This isn't real. This isn't real," Will muttered, but the words weren't enough to shake off the growing sense of failure. The creature was playing with his mind, turning every mistake, every weakness, into a weapon against him. He was being torn to pieces from the inside out, without being able to stop it. Lucas, in turn, felt the weight of his own insecurities. He had been the most impulsive, the most audacious. But now, as the creature moved around them, he felt that his own fear of being useless, of not being the hero he had always wanted to be, was coming true. The image of his parents, disappointed in him for always running away from responsibilities, hung before him, strong and relentless. The words they never said, but which he dreaded to hear, filled his mind. He was being haunted by these voices, and the creature was feeding these emotions. He looked at his friends, but what he saw was not the unity he had hoped for. He saw two distant faces, distorted by fear. The loneliness he felt seemed to materialize, making him question whether he really had any control over his own life, whether he was really capable of saving others. The creature knew this and was rendering him unable to act. I'm not what you think," Lucas murmured, his voice full of anguish. I can't be the hero." The creature was exploiting their deepest vulnerabilities, using its own insecurities against them. She was not just a physical threat, but a force that worked in the psychological field, entering their minds, shaping their fears, and creating illusions that seemed more real than anything they could touch. But, at the same time, this manipulation began to awaken something more in the three friends. The strength of friendship and the loyalty they shared began to emerge from the shadows of their fears. They were not alone. Even when the memories of failures and insecurities haunted them, there was something that united them stronger than any fear. "It doesn't matter what she does," Sarah said, her voice now firmer. "We are together. We are stronger than that." Will and Lucas looked at each other, and for the first time that night, they saw something clearer than fear: confidence. They were more than their flaws. They were more than his insecurities. Their friendship was what made them invincible. But what still awaited them was a much greater challenge. The creature had learned to adapt to their minds, but they could still fight it. The real battle was just beginning, with the creature now more aware of the psychological power it had over them. The fight was far from over. The real strength left to the friends came not from their weapons or the shining blade, but from their unity. Would they be ready to face the greatest challenge of all? The tension that took over the treehouse seemed to intensify, but it was not. Only fear that hung in the air. Something else was going on, something they couldn't fully explain. The creature, which had previously seemed to be driven by simple hunger or anger, now revealed itself as a much more complex presence. Will, Sarah, and Lucas were beginning to understand that they were facing something much more than a predator. They were facing an ancient force that sought not only revenge, but something profoundly more destructive. As the creature moved around, its heavy, jagged footsteps reverberated as a reminder of its true nature. But his eyes, the same eyes of pure emptiness and darkness, now reflected something else. They weren't just the eyes of a hungry beast. It was as if the creature was feeding on something more than fear. It was destroying the connection between them, between what made them human. She's not just trying to kill us, Sarah said, her words hard to get out but full of growing understanding. She wants to erase what we are. It's not just a physical attack, it's trying to undo us, break us inside. Will and Lucas heard Sarah's words, and something formed in their minds. They were facing more than a physical enemy. The creature wasn't just seeking revenge or destruction. It wanted to destroy everything that united them, everything that made them who they were. She wanted to break human bonds, feeding on every feeling of fear, insecurity, and doubt until there was nothing left. Lucas, still with the weight of fear in his chest, looked at the creature, now closer than ever. He felt the impact of his words, of his vision. He's trying to make us lose everything, he said, his voice low and anguished. Our friendship, our trust, our humanity, that's what she seeks. It's not just revenge. She wants to destroy what we are inside. The Skinwalker seemed to understand that its effects were starting to work. Every word, every thought seemed to echo inside their brains, fueling a sense of isolation and despair. But there was a part of Will that refused to give up. They couldn't allow Skinwalker to win. They couldn't let him break the one thing that still united them, friendship. We're not going to let that happen, Will said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension that gripped them. He turned to Lucas and Sarah, and for the first time, the sense of solidarity was stronger than fear. We are in this together, and as long as we are together, it cannot destroy us. Sarah looked at the two of them, her words now full of determination. She can try to turn us against each other. She can try to break our fears. But it will fail. We are stronger than that. The creature, noticing the renewed resistance, growled with immense fury. His eyes shone with a menacing glow, as if he were feeling the loss of control. Not only was she facing a physical attack, she was dealing with something stronger, something she couldn't fully comprehend. The bonds between Will, Sarah, and Lucas were more powerful than Skinwalker could have imagined, and this strength was beginning to shape a plan of resistance. But the creature, now more enraged than ever, reacted more brutally. She wasn't going to walk away easily. There was more to be revealed, more of the true essence of the creature that lurked in the shadows. She didn't just seek revenge or destruction, but complete mastery over everything the characters stood for. As the battle intensified, the real test began. The Skinwalker had underestimated the power of friendship and loyalty, but time was running out. The real question now was, could the friends maintain their unity and confront it definitively? Or would the creature separate them one by one until nothing was left of their souls? The battle wasn't over yet, but a palpable sense of change in the air made their hearts beat faster. The creature, which until then had been unbeatable and ruthless, now showed signs of faltering, as if something had broken its hold. The fear that had gripped them now gave way to something more powerful, the strength of unity. What was once an absolute terror turned into the strongest of his weapons. They had faced the worst, and they were still standing, not by physical strength or by fighting the creature, but by the human connection they shared. The Skinwalker, with all his malice and power, couldn't destroy that. As monstrous as the threat before them was, there was something deeper in the game. The creature, with its ability to manipulate the deepest fears and insecurities, revealed the true game they were involved in. It was not just a struggle for physical survival. It was a struggle for the very identity of each of them, for the essence of what was left after fear and destruction tried to erase them, for the ability to resist and stay together. As the Skinwalker advanced, his steps heavier and his eyes burning with fury, the energy that once seemed uncontrollable was now used to his advantage. Sarah, Will, and Lucas began to understand that the real battle was not just in the physical body, but in the minds. They didn't need to be faster or stronger than the creature. They needed to be more resilient. They needed to be more human than ever. "You won't make it," Sarah said firmly, her voice unwavering, now full of conviction. The glow of her blade, which had faded before, now returned with more intensity, reflecting not only the light around her, but the inner strength she and her friends had found. The Skinwalker, as he approached, felt the change. He was no longer facing three fearful young men. He was now facing three souls who refused to give in to the darkness he wished to impose. Something that could not be seen, something invisible, was growing among the friends. It was the strength of friendship, trust, and loyalty. For a moment, the creature hesitated. The psychological power she had used against the three of them was beginning to weaken. The Skinwalker had believed that they could consume everything that made them human, but he underestimated one thing: humanity's ability to resist its own destruction. It could not be corrupted or easily broken, not as long as there was still some connection, some hope, any will to fight. "You can't destroy what you can't understand," Luke said, the words coming from his lips with renewed force. He was no longer thinking about his own weaknesses or the failures of the past. He was only focused on what mattered now: the union they had created, the unbreakable strength that friendship could represent. Realizing that his psychological manipulation was no longer effective, the Skinwalker let out a guttural roar, charged with fury and frustration. In the last-ditch effort, he struck with renewed speed and ferocity, like an unchecked beast. But the blade, bathed in light that seemed to come from another dimension, and the energy that enveloped them were enough to prevent him from advancing. One more step. The human essence he was trying to destroy had become his own defense. Sarah, her blade gleaming, charged forward with renewed courage. She wasn't fighting the creature with fear or anger, but with a strength that came from something deeper. She was fighting for what they stood for together. She didn't just want to survive. She wanted to live, with her friends, with her humanity. Intact, with one decisive move it attacked, and the blade cut through the darkness around the creature. The Skinwalker, who once seemed invincible, faltered. The cry of pain he emitted was not just physical, it was the sound of his disintegration, of his inability to destroy what he feared most: the true strength of humanity. The Skinwalker began to disappear, not in a spectacle of destruction, but slowly, as if his own form was being absorbed by the darkness he himself had invoked. Their forms began to crumble, and the weight of their presence faded, leaving behind only the echo of their distorted words. When silence finally fell, Sarah, Will, and Lucas were on their knees, exhausted but alive. The fear was still there, but something more important had prevailed. They had won not by force or power, but by emotional endurance, by human connection that refused to be broken. They had faced not only the creature, but the very fear it had planted in their minds. And now, with the creature disappearing, they knew that even though the battle was won, the fight for human identity would never end. They had won. But what else did the future hold? The battle against fear and destruction was far from over. The union they had created had protected them this time, but would it be enough for what was to come? The real question wasn't what the Skinwalker represented, but what they themselves represented, and how they would maintain their strength, even when the monsters, whether real or not, continued to test their will.